Hi there. I'm going to make two videos about the Pageau and Vervaeke interview from last year. The first one is going to be their distinctions on how each approaches the meaning crisis, or basically an understanding of their spiritual approaches. The second video will relate their mutual understanding of reality, their metaphysics, to the metaphysics of quality. So in this video, I will be commenting on a dialogue between Orthodox Christian Jonathan Pageau, who is known for explaining the deep meaning of Christian symbolism, and secular Buddhist, and maybe even you could call him a Neoplatonist, maybe even a Stoic, Jonathan Vervaeke, who these days is known for his series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I would like to refer to them by their first names, but obviously I can't, so I'm going to have to call them by their last names. Because this is pretty much an interview with Vervaeke on Pageau's channel, much of the material is from Vervaeke, so you probably won't get a full picture of either of their viewpoints through my video. So you really need to watch the actual interview and watch some of their videos. And I will link to the original interview that I'm using in this video at the end. My concern in this video is to delineate two viable ways of addressing the meaning crisis and an approach to spirituality for the 21st century. I also propose that these two ways encapsulate roughly two approaches that might be chosen by the necessarily rough temperamental divides, say between those who are more conservative or traditional and religious, and those who are more liberal and secular in their worldview. But there is a difference between these two guys and your average secular and or religious approach, in that these two men are practicing spirituality with the full understanding of the meaning crisis and what it means to live in the 21st century. This is an important added dimension to their approaches, and that's what makes them so important, and that's what interests me about it. So I'm going to break down what they're saying into these 5 categories. The first one is conceptions of reality. Second is framing the problem of the meaning crisis. Third is the secular approach. Fourth is the religious approach, and then how they are on agreement in these approaches.
So myths aren't sort of ancient stories about the past that are irrelevant. They're about perennial patterns or pivotal moments in the transformation of consciousness and cognition. So I think we're sort of in agreement about the use of
definitely.
Okay, so I think what emerges is a two-world mythology. The point about the two-world mythology, there's a deep grammar there. It's trying to articulate this difference. There's the everyday world of suffering and illusion, but then there's the higher world. There's the world that we can realize in both senses of the word. We can come into awareness and we can make real. It's where we can be most real. And what happens is the notion of meaning is about being connected to the real world.
Right.
And the notion of wisdom isn't about why would you want to fit into the everyday world? Why do you want to live long and prosper in this torturous world of suffering and delusion? Wisdom now becomes, no, how do I self-transcend so that I can increase the meaning, I can increase the connectedness to this realness where we can stop suffering and we can come to flourishing. And
so Vervaeke sees our spiritual world as two realities, one kind of mundane and everyday, and the other transcendent and dynamic. And he calls that the real world. And we want to be in harmony with ourselves while simultaneously being connected to the real world. You could call this harmony congruence, which is a term that the great psychologist Carl Rogers used. And that was, in fact, the point of Rogerian therapy, is to become congruent. If we are out of congruence with ourselves and the real world, we can easily find salience in distractions, in bullshit, rather than in the real world. And this state of connection to the real world is what you would characterize as wisdom, and this is where you would find meaning. Plato called this connection, this congruent connection to the real world, anagage, the emergence from the cave. And this is the term Vervaeke uses, and this is the term we're going to use.
Right. Plato not only discovered that we want to be he discovered the meta-desire. In addition to whatever we desire it to be real. He also discovered the other meta-desire. In addition to whatever we desire to have it with peace of mind. We desire to have this internal alignment. So we're not at war with ourselves.
Yeah.
So that we have this, and his great insight, in my opinion, is the idea of anagoge, the ascent, that these can be linked together. As I align the parts of the psyche, right? See, the thing about that inner conflict, right? When I'm in inner conflict, the monster is making things salient, way above and beyond what I believe. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
That's the field of bullshit.
It's the traditional, let's say, the traditional Christian or traditional Orthodox solution has been to talk about hierarchy and to have this notion of attention and this focus on nodes, let's say, these nodes of attention, and then there's a hierarchy of attention which manifests itself around, and then it kind of splinters into basically just kind of this chaotic potential that's there on the fringe. And so that seemed to me like that's how we experience the world, and because of that, it makes it possible for things to move, let's say, from the periphery into the center, and there's room for that to happen. And so like you said, you don't necessarily have to pay attention to the things that are on the fringe. They kind of exist as these monstrous, ambiguous forms. But then as they move closer towards the center, all of a sudden they start to take, their identity starts to clarify, let's say, and then they connect themselves to the nodes that are already there. That's kind of how, at least phenomenologically, that's how I see it. But I don't, in a normal, like in the traditional world, you would have these cycles, right?
Yes.
And so I know that you talk about how Christianity is more linear and moves towards, let's say, the eschaton, but there is in Christianity there's both movements. Like there's the cyclical movement of the liturgical year, and then there's this movement towards the eschaton. But the eschaton is also it's circular to an extent in the sense that it's a return to the garden, but then it's the expansion of the garden into the totality. Let's say sometimes people wonder in the Christian tradition why we have the Trinity. And the Trinity is the infinite representation of those two things together. The notion that you need, in reality, the highest image of all things is both absolute unity, completely one, and then at the same time completely three or completely multiple at the same time without contradiction. And so it's really an image of how the world works, basically.
In my estimation, Pageau's metaphysical view is similar to Vervaeke's, which I think this is one of the reasons that the interview works so well, and certainly my interest in it. But rather than real world, Pageau looks at the top or the center of the hierarchy as our point of focus. Things on the fringe are presently irrelevant, but the fringe can move toward the center, let's just say as needed or as occurs, which means that the actual content of what is meaningful dynamically changes. But we remain focused in the center or at the top of the hierarchy. The process itself is stable, and that's important. The content is what changes. And I believe that this is what Pageau means when he says about the Trinity, is describing this. And this is how the world works. This is the underlying pattern, the metaphysics. But where Vervaeke indicates the real world is the focus of our attention, Pageau might say that it is the garden that keeps our focus, which is less ambiguous and more traditionally symbolic variation of the description of the phenomenological experience. Thus, the conceptualized linear nature of Christianity is included in Pageau's worldview towards the eschaton, which seems to be described by Vervaeke. This linear nature, let's just say, is more of a real world concern, but it's the cyclical nature present in both worldviews that's the key element that distinguishes these approaches from others, and again aligns them with the problems we face in the technological and information age of the 21st century.
Happening. The real possibility of autonomous AI is going to impact this culture and our self-understanding in a way that is going to make the Industrial Revolution look like a cakewalk. If you're not paying attention to cognitive science and you're off running your idea of reducing rationality to syllogistic reasoning, right? Then you're just not preparing people or yourself for what's coming.
Yeah.
What Vervaeke is laying out here is the problem. We are entering an age where artificial intelligence or technology or digital networking is going to be the key element or a key element of our consciousness, and it already obviously is. I mean, you know, how much time do we spend engaged in the digital world? This is what I've been saying in some of my videos, but not as articulately as Vervaeke puts it here, which is what draws me to these guys. They articulate what we already know, but is still milling around ambiguously in our intuition.
Even people who are secularized still try to understand the meaning of their life in terms of how it progresses or has a purpose, or they understand it in terms of a normative. How am I self-actualizing? How am I self-transcending? Or they understand it nomologically. How well connected am I to reality?
So here Vervaeke explains that in our evolution of consciousness, we still have a desire for transcendence, to connect to the real world, for meaning and wisdom, but we don't have ways of getting there. The wisdom tradition has been cast aside for a variety of reasons. It kind of reminds you of Nietzsche, which is coming up. So the three orders of worldview that Vervaeke refers to that have been undermined and that has resulted basically in the meaning crisis, and I'm using Vervaeke's word, this is from his book. These three orders, the nomological order, the narrative order, and the normative order, became tightly integrated and mutually supporting. The story of God's love, narrative order, inspired the rational mysticism ascension to God, normative order, through the deep connection between the rational mind and the structure of the cosmos, nomological order. The world was inherently meaningful, beautiful, rational, valuable, and spiritual. We were all tightly connected to this cosmos, and we had a coherent place and purpose within it. So losing these orders, basically through the advent of science for the most part, but other shifts too, have led us to the meaning crisis. And this, I'm going to link to where I got this description of the three orders. I think it's the 6th chapter of the book, so I'll link to that.
And what I think, when I say we lack wisdom institutions, I'll say to my class, where do you go for information? Well, the internet.
Yeah.
Where do you go for knowledge? Well, science, the university. Where do you go for wisdom? And there's a deafening silence because we don't have institutions and cultures that afford anagoge. We do not have that anymore. That's also what I mean by we lost the meaning crisis. Yeah. That's also what has been lost in the meaning crisis. Yeah. We do not have collections of people that are instituted together to help us afford anagoge.
Right. I mean, I think that maybe that's where we will kind of disagree, in the sense that I think that one of the things in your book, you talk about this meaning crisis and kind of the breakdown of the Christian. Sure. The Christian narrative, let's say, and I totally agree. Obviously, I think that that's what's happening for sure. But the other thing that I see is that the Christian narrative seems to have that breakdown in itself, right? And so the Christian narrative sets itself up as something that will die and will come back. Like Christ died and came back, and Christ says, you know, this idea like, when I return, will I find faith in the world? And so this notion that even the church itself has to somewhat die, or at least come down, like go down into death and then come back. And so I don't see the Christian narrative as being completely done. I see it as part of that kind of descent. You know, it's in that obvious descent, but then there's something I think that it doesn't mean that what's going to totally come out of it is going to be the same as what was there before. But I think that there is something in the story of Christ which anticipates this going to the end and then coming back.
So for Pageau, again, this breakdown is figured into the Christian narrative. While we live in a clown world, while the zombie horsemen ride through, we too need to ride this through while believing in Christ, while knowing that it is promised that he is coming again. And so I would say this problem is in a way a bigger one for Vervaeke than for Pageau, because, but we still have to suffer the clown world right now. And this is the loss of meaning at the end of a big cycle, like Pageau says. We need, nonetheless, we are at the end of that cycle, and we're in this clown world, and we need solutions to guide us in the right direction toward the return of Christ. And remember, Pageau's language, by the way, it is not shallow fundamentalism. It is symbolic and mythological. He refers to a huge shift.
We have a scientific worldview in which we don't belong.
Exactly. We don't live in the scientific. I keep telling people, you do not live in the scientific world. It's a form of alienation. Like to think that you live in that world is to be very alienated into your actual experience.
So what happens is we have this whole mythological and conceptual grammar. We're still using it.
Yeah.
Right. We're still using it, but it's not. And be careful here. Don't misinterpret me. I'm a scientist. I believe in the value of science, right? Yeah. But the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, what's going on in the 12th century with the changing in reading, the change in the conception of God, where what's primary about him isn't what you would say his nous, but it's his will, right? And that leads right to Nietzsche's will to power. Mm-hmm. There's a direct line there between, the dominant feature of us and God is our will. Not our rational love or our loving rationality, but our will, our assertiveness. And belief goes from beleben, giving your heart, to assertion, to assertion, to assertion, to assertion, right? And so I think what I mean by the meaning crisis is, what we see is we still have this grammar all the way back to the axial period of trying to understand meaning, but the two worlds mythology and the three conceptual orders that allowed us to express it, articulate it, celebrate it, share it, they have all been seriously undermined by our intellectual and cultural and also economic history, because we also live more by ourselves, which is also bad, right? So all of these things have conspired. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Right? To basically undermine our ability to, right, to access these three orders and to partake in the axial mythology. So while it still fills our cognition, because we still use literacy and numeracy and second order thinking, we still have these experiences. We don't have the means for, as I say, articulating, expressing, celebrating them. And so we're in a meaning crisis. And so people keep looking for things that will, feel surrogate things that will give them a sense of purpose, give them a sense of self-transcendence, give them a sense of connectedness, etc.
Science is valid. It affords us the great progress which has enhanced our life and increased its duration. Even now you're seeing progress even in the most impoverished places in the world. So it's really quite amazing. The miraculous contribution of science has been, since the Enlightenment, though, a substitute for God, because it is like a miracle that we can do this stuff. It really is. And the products of science can indeed substitute for God, because we have seen that our will can override nature. We will godlike powers with science, but we are learning that it cannot actually replace God or meaning or wisdom. We still need to be connected to the real world. If we're not, we will substitute the false God of bullshit, because without being, again, congruent, without being on track, without focusing on the top of the hierarchy or the garden, bullshit can be salient enough to mislead us, because we can't discern it from the real world. And his tradition already believes that this will happen. So I would say, I may be going on a limb saying this, I've sort of implied it, I think this is generally a more optimistic view of the way things are now than a non-secular understanding. And in the non-secular understanding, it's us that is responsible for the second coming. But at the same time, we're both responsible for taking on these practices and adhering to them.
Is like formulate the problem really well. It goes back to what we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
If you haven't done really good relevance realization, really good problem formulation, you're not going to get the insight. You're not going to get the solution. This is a very complex problem.
But, what I wanted to get to is that in a normal world, you have at the end of each cycle, you would have these carnivals. And the carnival, like the zombie would have been, I mean, obviously it wasn't, but something akin to the zombie is what you would encounter in a carnival. That is this a moment of loss of meaning at the end of a cycle.
Yes.
So that it's like everything has to kind of go back into death, and then everything starts again. You know. And so the sense that I get is that, let's say if you have these little cycles, you know, and every year you have the carnival. And then, you know, but then you have these, in the Bible, you have, let's say, the week with the Sabbath at the end, and then you have the Jubilee, 50-year Jubilee. You have, and then, like at the end of every year, you have Purim. So you have these, you know, these cycles on cycles on cycles. And so it feels like now, like the whole cycle, let's say from, you know, from how do you call it? The actual age?
The actual revolution. It's not my term, it's Carl Jasper's term.
Right,
Carl
yeah.
Also talks a lot about it.
I'm fine using that term. Like, let's say from the whole cycle, we're reaching the carnival of that whole cycle. So it's like everything has become upside down. Everything is the monster, is entertainment, is diversion, you know. And so there's all these so it's as if it's filling up our whole society. Like our whole society is a clown society, basically. And so it's like there's definitely a huge shift that has to happen. Like that has to happen in order for things to start again.
Pageau disagrees that we do not have wisdom traditions. He thinks wisdom traditions are alive and well in Christianity, specifically for him, Orthodox Christianity. And in his tradition, Orthodox Christianity, breakdown, or even Christianity in general, the breakdown is expected and written into the narrative, which means one remains a Christian no matter what the state of the outside world. Remember, you've got this process. Despite what's happening, you always adhere to this process because Christ will return, and that's written into the narrative. Although the way Christ returns, who knows how it will manifest.
But if I can get more properly aligned, my self-deception decreases. I start to see a little bit more deeply into reality. That satisfies that desire. And then reality starts to disclose itself to me. That aids me in aligning the psyche. And these loop together. As I get more internally aligned, I get more aligned with reality. As I get more aligned with reality, I get more internally, right? And this anagoge, the ascent out of the cave, the famous myth in Plato. That to me is, I think, the great insight. And this generation of Cog-Sci is trying to radically undermine that Cartesian grammar of disconnectedness. The mind isn't radically disconnected from the body. Minds aren't radically disconnected from each other. They're not radically disconnected from the world. We talk about embodiment and embeddedness and connectiveness, right? These are becoming, and I've tried to show you a little bit in what I've been trying to exemplify. This third generation Cog-Sci is radically trying to undermine that worldview in which we don't belong. And it's cognitive science is taking, I call it the naturalistic imperative in cognitive sciences. How do we fit back into this worldview? Are attracted to, sort of Buddhism and Taoism. Part of that is purely historical. Part of it is because those are traditions that aren't part of that decadent history. And so people want to get outside of that history because they don't want to fall prey to it. And so I think that's a very, I don't think it's fair to just ignore that. I think that's a legitimate concern people have. So I would hope, and this is a real hope, I'm not being coy here. I would hope that the resources that people like you have within, right, Christian, like I said, I'm especially appreciative of, I want to talk to you about it. I just ran an experiment on mystical experience and how it contributes to meaning in life. You know, like the data is like, it's there. Like I would love it if you guys could also articulate that, this desire to escape from the historical constraints that we're in, right? And then coupled with that is sort of a pluralistic understanding. The understanding, like, I see people cultivating what I would call real wisdom and compassion within Buddhism, within Taoism, within Zen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, so for many people, the idea of a singular voice on this seems very questionable to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's what I ultimately mean when I say I'm sort of non-theist secular.
So the first approach is Pageau's secular approach. As stated earlier, to achieve wisdom is to connect to what's real and to do so in a harmonious and a congruent way, in the flow state, as Pageau has described in great detail. This is anagage. It's Vervaeke's working solution to the meaning crisis, and that is to induce this anagage. This does include science in doing so. In other videos, such as his TED Talk, he indicates how innovations in cognitive science can produce insight. However, the cognitive science he's referring to is one that has a basis in spirituality, and one that necessarily integrates Buddhist and other wisdom practices. He calls this Synoptic Integration. He himself practices Vipassana, Tai Chi, Lectio Divina, and Stoicism, and several other ancient practices. These practices remain valid because they persist outside our historical constraints. So it sounds a little bit like Phaedrus getting a handle on the ghost of reason. Just the way that Vervaeke is going back and getting to it, although a very different thing. But I think that's an interesting parallel.
This very difficult practice,
right?
Of how do I integrate the ontology, the epistemology, the methodology of neuroscience with psychology, with artificial intelligence?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's really, I'm talking about that. I'm talking about trying to come up with a synoptic integration. We both acknowledged, I think, that in the history, even in the history of Christianity, I mean, like the way Plotinus
mm-hmm.
and Paul were brought together by Augustine, that's a radical thing. And many people, of course, rejected it when Augustine did this.
Yeah.
I'm talking about that. I'm talking about that kind of transformative synoptic integration that's going to produce something that is not currently foreseeable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not trying to be an empty utopic. What I'm saying is, no, here are the practices you do. Mm-hmm. Here are the, here's how you do the cognitive science. Here's what the cognitive science says. Here are the kinds of processes of attention and insight and reflection and self-regulation that seem to reliably correlate, predict, help to afford enhanced meaning in life, enhanced wisdom. We are studying all of this scientifically right now. Right? And so I am saying, no, get these to talk to each other as much as possible. This is all, I think of all of my work, all of my scientific work, all of my existential practices, all of my sapiential endeavors are all pointed towards getting this.
Okay.
If you want to put it that way. So, right? Because I think the ability, what we were talking about, we were disagreeing in some ways, agreeing in others, getting back to an enacted sacredness is ultimately the solution to the meaning crisis.
Right.
Vervaeke doesn't want to thrash the ghost of reason. He likes reason. He wants to thrash the ghost of decadence, I guess you would say, and to go back to implementing these wisdom practices that connect us with the real world. Vervaeke is scientifically validating these practices, which may be a necessary thing. As Pageau said, once you kind of see that science is actually integrating with the phenomenological and is supporting spirituality, it becomes a little bit more valid. And I think we have to do it because you can't go back. We are already in the scientific revolution has happened.
In that, and I mean, I've had my kind of flirtation with that idea. Let's say before I became Orthodox, I kind of flirted with perennialism and those types of ideologies.
Sure.
I think that the difficulty that I came to realize is that you have to embody a narrative, like you have to live inside a story.
Yes.
And so the difficulty of the let's say of that approach of let's say wanting to take into account pluralism within your own story,
Sure.
right, is that you end up being on the margins. You end up living in the margin, right? You can't enter into the story. And so to me, there has to be a way to be able to live in the story and to embody the narrative, and that also includes the actual physical, going into a space, being part of a group. All that has to be part of it.
It has to be a shareable story. I get that. It has to be
exactly.
a shareable.
And so that has to be there, right? And so the fear that I have about I don't know enough about your solutions. I have seen kind of what Sam Harris talks about in terms of
I'm not talking.
Yeah. Well, even without attacking, let's say, religion, the idea of pulling different things from different technologies, let's say, from different traditions, and kind of back. And so for me, I still think that the best place in order to find that alignment is the church, because there is still, like, you still actually do physically go to the same place. You do physically stand in the same direction. You sing together. You recite. All those things are there to create that common experience. But then there's also an anthropology and a spirituality, especially in the Orthodox tradition, which is a mystical transformation of the person through the Jesus prayer and hesychasm and all that. So I think that's the idea of the return of Christ in Christianity has to do with this notion, because the all coming together, let's say, in the end it has to happen in a story. Like, it also has to happen to a certain extent. It has to happen in a person, which is why most religions have these central figures: Moses, Buddha, Christ. Like, it has to be embodied in the world.
Pageau's religious approach is that Pageau is an Orthodox Christian who is practicing. And so the approach is already established. To alleviate the meaning crisis, the end of the cycle, the clown, topsy-turvy world, one continues to practice in the traditional way, attending church, doing the rituals and the prayers, of course engaging in the community. But again, Pageau has a deep understanding of the symbolic nature of Christianity and how this symbolism illustrates and helps us understand the structure of reality. It's a description of the way the world works, as he says. In an upside-down world where there is so much distraction, we need to understand the structure of reality so we know what we're looking at when all this other stuff is all over the place, the zombies, the clowns. We need to know what the structure of reality is now more than ever.
So relevance realization, I try to use this term, it's transjective. It's not what the Romantics said. It's not some inner arbitrary thing that we paint we express onto the empty canvas of the world.
No.
Neither is Locke. It's not something that the world just imposes on our blank slate of our mind. It's like, and this is what relevance realization says, it's a way in which the world and the mind are coupled together so that they are mutually self-disclosing. Mutual self-disclosure is love.
Yeah, it's like a sexual relationship. It's the meaning of heaven and earth.
In the Hebrew Bible, yes, exactly. So, and the idea is, because it has these pre and post egoic elements to it, it is mysterious in Marcel's sense of the word. We can't ultimately frame it. No. Look, I can't make my relevance realization. I can't completely externalize it. I'm always framing.
Exactly.
Right? And so whenever I try to frame my framing, I realize, oh crap, I can't do it. It opens up. And whenever I'm framing the world, I realize, oh, there's a more encompassing. Oh crap.
It's bigger. Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. Remember, we talked about at the beginning. Relevance realization is inherently self-correcting.
Mm-hmm.
Insight, and think about how insight is that flash, and how meaningful insights are to us.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the things that relevance realization is constituted to find an interest in, deeply care about, is relevance realization.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? One of the things we do is, and I mean this both in the sense of enhancing and celebrating, is we play with our capacity for relevance realization. Think about music. Music is pure, and think about how much we associate music with sacredness, because we're playing with this process, these coupling of these mysteries, the co-creation of our agency and the world, and the way in which music is kind of like moments of insight that are being triggered.
And
Right?
it's like an ebb and flow. Like you move
Yes.
from insight towards question, towards insight, towards
Yes.
question. Like
Totally. It's that evolving. And I think so when we come up with cultural forms, mythos, right?
Yeah.
Symbols, stories, in order to make significant to us this significance making, when we make meaning making meaningful to us, right? When we celebrate it and enhance it and cultivate it, that's what I mean by sacredness.
Okay. Yeah. I understand. Yeah, I totally understand. I always tell people that the structure of the church, let's say that this concentric structure of the church with the Eucharist in the center, and and this kind of moving towards invisible mystery that's hidden in the host and everything, that what that's about is it's about getting you to participate in how the world works. Like it's not about that. It's about, it's like you said, it's about relevant realization. Like the sacred is about knowing what's sacred, like or participating in what's sacred. It's the things which moves into it itself. And so it's not, when people kind of ask you like, what does it refer to ultimately? It's like it's in a way it is referring outwards towards certain signs and symbols, but in the end it's actually moving into itself. It's trying to move you into that very process of moving into something and moving into itself.
And that's
what Vervaeke and Pageau agree upon, and this is why it is so interesting to me, is relevance realization, which we will go into much more in the second part of this video. Vervaeke is going to describe what this is, and this will align with the dynamic quality of the hierarchical nature of the Christian symbolism that Pageau describes. So, like I said, I'm going to go much more into this agreement in part 2, because this agreement parallels with the metaphysics of quality. But right now we are concerned where the two agree on the underlying structure of reality that informs their distinct worldviews. They also agree with the fact that there is indeed a meaning crisis, and of course zombies are involved. Both agree that ritual is important for Pageau to become to embody the narrative, and for Vervaeke to get into the flow state, become harmonious and attached and connect with the real world, the anagage. Pageau and Vervaeke also very much agree on that back and forth dynamic, which is, let's just say between heaven and earth, bottom down and top up, and that's for the second video.
And it's interesting because Saint Irenaeus, when he wrote his book, against the Gnostics, it was actually called something like the so-called Gnostics. Because what he said is that when your proposition is that, let's say, phenomenological world or the manifest world is corrupt in itself, you're actually missing out on true knowledge, which is this union of heaven and earth. And so he posits the incarnation as true gnosis, because it is really this joining of all things together. Like and so it is this joining of heaven and earth in the figure of Christ. Is true gnosis for Saint Irenaeus. And it has to do with what you're saying, is that in order for true knowledge is really this idea of the we would say the nous in Orthodox
Platonism too, of course.
Right. So this ego capacity to intuit the world, and then it comes into contact with the created world, and then there's this unity, this possibility of the transfigured world, of a world that is full of, but it's also not static. It's dynamic, but it's constantly full of light.
But that's what I mean.
Vervaeke indicates a need for communities, which he calls wisdom institutions, to be created where people can come together and cultivate anagage. This may also consist of classes or dharma talks, let's just say. Pageau sees the breakdown and resurrection of meaning already built into the grand hero narrative of Christianity, and that Christianity descends and is reborn. We continue to follow the rituals, and this is the true difference, I think, between Jordan Peterson and Vervaeke, which I got this wrong last time. I said that Peterson was ritual and Vervaeke was experiential. But what it seems like is that the ritual is important in both regards. One, to induce anagoge, the other to embody the narrative, but there's a lot of crossover in these two, which makes it so interesting. So I think the difference, I think something that comes up for me is that Peterson is a deeply religious person, or so he has said this, but he can't 100% believe in God. He can't connect there, whereas Pageau does, and Vervaeke declares himself as secular. So it's interesting. I've had this dilemma myself. I characterize my own spirituality as complicated, and I suppose by complicated you could say I am, as Vervaeke and Peterson indicated, experiencing a meaning crisis myself. I want to be deeply connected to that real world. I've always referred to it as the noetic dimension, or the spiritual dimension that Viktor Frankl refers to. But I have a hard time actually having an embodied understanding of God. You know, a belief in God, is, if you will, in any kind of traditional sense. I feel like I'm suffering from that same barrier because I want to, but I can't get there all the way in a Christian sense. And maybe this is just because I've been raised in the time I have been. I think that has a lot to do with it. Yet when Carl Jung was asked, do you believe in God? He says, no, not believe, I know. And somehow that resonates. I do have this feeling that knowing that is outside the realm of any previous understanding I have of religion. Maybe I believe in God more as Tao, as a force in the universe that is absolutely constant and absolutely dynamic at the same time. Very important, I think. In a way, I feel like this is expressed in the description Pageau gives of the Trinity. And need I state this, it reflects very much dynamic quality. I would say my belief is that God is something like dynamic quality. Again, both approaches take into account an understanding of the underlying structure of reality and proceeding from there. These are practices that can ground us as we sort out the chaos at the end of the cycle or during the meaning crisis. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time for part